Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the virtual book launch of Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution by Jakkie Cilliers, published by Jonathan Ball Publishers. My name is Jennifer Malik, and I'm the editor of the reading list. We're joined this evening by Nastassia Arendse, who's a television anchor at the SABC, where she helps viewers navigate the world of money and investing. She's the host of a weekly book feature at the public broadcaster, where she sits down with local and international authors. And in addition to that, you can catch her on Kaya FM for all your investing and money needs and wants. Dr. Jakkie Cilliers is a well-known Africa analyst, author, and popular commentator. He's the founder of the Institute for Security Studies and served as its executive director until 2015. The ISS is a regional think tank with offices in Dakar, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and Pretoria. Cilliers has presented numerous papers and published a number of books on matters relating to peace and security in Africa, which is a very relevant topic at the moment, obviously. His current interests relate to issues around South Africa and Africa's long-term future, which we'll all be watching keenly over the next few months. Cilliers is also an extraordinary professor at the Center of Human Rights and the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. The book that we're launching this evening is Africa First, his most recent book, which was published a few days ago. Obviously, with all the bookstores being shut at the moment, it's only available as an ebook, but you won't want to wait, I don't think. And it's available on all ebook platforms, Amazon, Kobo, Etsy, Snaplify, wherever you get your ebooks. Jonathan Ball Publishers are also running an ebook promotion at the moment, so you can get it for the super good deal price of 100 Rand. So that's a real bargain. So you should do that now while you're watching. Leave your comments on Facebook and Twitter. We'll have a Q&A session for the readers at the end. And enjoy the launch.
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer. Jakkie, always a pleasure talking to you. I think the first time you and I spoke was when we were discussing one of your previous books, Fate of a Nation, I think the 3 scenarios for South Africa's future. And tonight we're going to be talking about Africa and where it is right now, where do we come from, and most importantly, where it's going, which I can imagine a lot of investors and including, citizens are keeping an eye on. But before we get into various aspects of your book and some of the issues that come out of there and some of the proposals you also raise, let's have a look at a quick video that I believe will be a scene setter to give the viewers a sense as to where the conversation is going to go tonight. So have a look.
Africa is a continent with boundless potential. From Tunisia's dignity and freedom revolution in the north, Nigeria and its growing population in the west, to South Africa with its world-class infrastructure and constitution, and Kenya's innovative startups practices in the east. Africa has the natural and human resources to fundamentally change its future and its contribution globally. Between now and 2040, almost every second person born globally is projected to be African. The continent will account for more than 60% of growth in the world's working age population. So why has the gap in average incomes between Africa and the rest of the world been increasing since independence in the 1960s? While the continent has seen improvements in infant mortality and life expectancy, Africa still suffers from massive poverty, inequality, weak economic growth, deindustrialization, an underdeveloped agricultural sector, and lack of technology. Things in Africa are improving, but it's happening at a much slower rate than in the rest of the world. What needs to be done to unleash Africa's potential and ignite a growth revolution? In Africa First, Jakkie Cilliers examines where the continent is at and where it will be in 2040 if it continues on its current path. Cilliers proposes and then models the impact of 11 sets of interventions from education to industrialization that would radically improve Africa's growth trajectory. This is not a blue skies approach. Cilliers shows exactly what policy interventions are needed to put Africa first. Yes, it is possible for the 55 countries on the continent to start catching up with the rest of the world, although it will take longer than most realize. Through sound planning and a more coordinated, sensible approach to economic and human development, Africa can capitalize on its dormant potential and radically improve its development trajectory. Africa First offers a comprehensive and authoritative guide for policymakers, researchers, and business on how to build a prosperous Africa. Now available at leading bookstores, Amazon, Kobo, and Spotify. Go to www.jakkiecilliers.org.
All right. Hopefully that definitely got you interested in where the conversation is going to go. Jakkie, the one thing that we're going to have to, I suppose, discuss before we even get into the book and the issues is that we use a lot of forecasts and scenarios, and you also use something called International Futures Forecasting Platform. Let's start off by outlining what that is so that as our listeners and the viewers continue to listen to some of the aspects you're going to bring up, they have a clear idea as to what is it about forecasts and scenarios that is not necessarily predictions.
Yes, thanks, Nastassia. We do forecasting, not predictions. If I was in the prediction business, I'd be a rich man. I was the head of the Institute for Security Studies for many years, and I stepped down and went to Denver on a sabbatical for a number of months, where I worked at the Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures. They run a global forecasting platform known as International Futures, which is a massive algorithm. It has something like 6,500 data sets in it. We forecast about 500 of these variables. So it allows you to look backward until about 1960 and forward until the end of the century for 186 countries. So IFS is a very data-heavy forecasting system. And what is unique about it is that it integrates everything. So when you change water and sanitation use in Lesotho, it will eventually start having an impact on female fertility rates and on population growth and on GDP per capita and so on and so forth. So it's a highly integrated forecasting platform.
All right, and I suppose at the end of this book launch, if many of you want to know how the International Futures works, you can go to Jakkie Cilliers' website, gives you a lot more detail. Jakkie, I mean, you start off in the beginning of the book by letting us know that you've been covering Africa for most of your adult life. And you, as you alluded to, you're the founder of the Institute of Security Studies, and that was founded in 1990. But the lovely part about your story is that you talk about how Addis Ababa is your favorite city. And perhaps you can tell us why and what it is you've seen, you know, going back and forth at least over, I think, 50 times, you say?
At least. I've been to Addis Ababa many, many times. I originally went there to work for the Organization of African Unity, now the Africa Union, and worked with their Commission on Peace and Security issues. So when I visited Addis in the beginning, it was a slow rural town, and I describe that. And the book is hopefully relatively accessible. It's not too heavy on the data. And then I recall how Addis has changed. You know, I used to jog from the Hilton where I stayed, which sounds grander than it is, to the OAU compound, and you could do that very easily amongst the goats and the stuff that were grazing inside the Addis Ababa city. And today, Addis Ababa is completely unrecognizable. It is probably the most rapid developing city in the world. And of course, it's benefited from a country, Ethiopia, that has had, in the last 11 years, the fastest growth rates in the world. So it's a teeming, modern, busy city. I mean, there's crime and grime all over Addis Ababa, but you see the dynamism and all the challenges in this one city. But my admiration for Addis is actually about the Ethiopians. I have many Ethiopian friends, and they are particularly hard-headed, and they don't. They have a proud history, and they take their development and their politics and everything else very, very seriously. So I have a grudging admiration for this nation that traces its history back thousands of years, own writing, own language, and that take great offense against anybody pointing a finger at them. So that determined nationalism has led to a country that has developed more rapidly than almost any country in Africa. And it's coming off very, very low levels. So yeah, no, I like the Ethiopians. I don't like their food, I should add. Injera is not my favorite.
Let's talk about the rationale of writing a book like this. What is it that you were trying to answer as your central question?
So I've been working on peace and security the Institute for Security Studies, for many years. I founded the Institute at the end of 1990. We were very heavily involved in the settlement process in South Africa. And for the next 15 years, I worked on peace and security issues, largely with the African Union and the Organization of African Unity. But I felt I was standing still. When you deal with peace and security issues, you deal with a symptom of a problem, instability. And I really became quite frustrated. And I've always had an orientation towards looking to the future and long-term forecasting. And therefore, when I stepped down as executive director in 2015, I was looking for a new challenge and looking at developmental prospects and where Africa and the continent is going gave me a new lease of life. So I've become a small town economist, but I look at development issues and I look at them in an integrated manner. And that's really, so what the book tries to answer, it asks the question, why is the income gap between Africa and the rest of the world continuing to increase? And there's a graph right at the beginning of the book. There aren't too many graphs, but this is one that shows this increasing gap. And I note the analogy, it's like the jaws of a yawning crocodile. Since the 1960s, things have improved in Africa, but much more slowly than in the rest of the world. And in the so-called current path forecast, that is where we think Africa will go, things improve in Africa. But things in Africa improve much more slowly than things in the rest of the world. So the central question is, what can be done to change that good but mediocre prospect out till 2040? So the book takes a view of where Africa has come from and then does a forecast across various dimensions towards 2040. And I take all these forecasts together, as the video showed, and in a final chapter, I bring them together in a combined Africa First scenario to see what is possible by 2040.
Right. You know, one of the things you mentioned in the book is that there is definitely a good news story to tell about the continent, especially when you look at improvements in well-being, such as infant mortality and life expectancy. And the one line that struck me was, and I quote here, "If Africa talked itself into development, it would be doing quite well." And then you hear about all these plans that we've had over the past few years, the 1980s Lagos Plan of Action for Economic Development. And then we have recently Agenda 2063. Because if we really wanted to, we could get our story together. What's holding us back, and why aren't these plans necessarily working, so to speak?
I can give you a very long answer, because the challenges that Africa find itself in is rooted in its development, in its history. And it is largely slavery, colonialism, and the way in which the African state is an imposed state. It is not like the Westphalian state or the states of Europe, a state that developed from the inside outward. There's the old saying, war makes the state and the state makes war. It is also true that nationalism generally precedes development, and that countries first need to find themselves before they, in actual fact, can cohere and get behind a clear development strategy. And many countries have done that, but Africa suffers from this imposed state mentality. We have imposed states. Over time, since the 1960s, African states have created an own sense of belonging. Apart from our history of state formation, which is still today, a big factor, we have also been served by extraordinarily bad leadership in Africa. We have a series of authoritarian leaders, mostly, remember the eras of military coup d'etats and so on, that have looked after their own pockets and not looked at the future of their people. And we have tried to leapfrog. We've tried to, in Ghana and many other countries, try to find some kind of a silver bullet that suddenly we can take Africa and propel it into a modern industrial era. Many of those mind frames come from the jumps that the Soviet Union tried to make previously, decades ago, when it tried to undergo rapid industrialization, of course, with a large peasant population. Africa has never been managed to get serious around agriculture. We talk a lot about agriculture, but we don't do anything about it. So no African country has started at the fundamentals of development. And the fundamentals of development is food security. Feed your people, educate your people, get through your demographic dividend, and then you go up the value-added curve over time. But it's a long process. So so it's a combination of a variety of factors that sees Africa growing significantly below its potential. And development happens, in a sense, from the bottom up. You need to look at the basics. And many African leaders think that if they can only imagine a better future or come with some fancy new scheme, that they will jumpstart their country. It's not true. What we need are technocratic leaders that have an unerring focus on improving the productive structures of their economy. Now that's a big economic word that you would understand and that I sort of half understand, but it means that you make your agricultural sector more productive and that you move labor from agriculture into manufacturing and eventually into services. But what Africa's growth path is that labor is moving from informal sector, subsistence farming into informal areas, in informal labor in urban slum areas. And that is not productive growth. Productive growth is where you add the amount of goods that you produce for every unit of labor, that becomes more productive. That's typically done by what is known as going up the manufacturing escalator. What Africa has embarked upon is an escalator that also goes up, but it goes very slowly. It's a slow growth services sector, and we have to therefore change the productive structures of African economies, and that requires work across a range of issues. There's no simple solution to this. We need to get our agriculture sorted. We need to get to our demographic dividend, which increases the contribution of labor to growth. We need to invest in basic infrastructure that gives people water, running water, sanitation. We have to improve education levels, and we have to implement the African Continental Free Trade Area. And there are 11 of these contributions that I model in the book as a chapter on each. So including the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I look at the potential of leapfrogging in Africa. What would greater peace contribute to growth in Africa? What would better governance, democracy contribute? And I model all of these things. These things can all be modeled. We can forecast what is the impact of improved governance on development, for example.
Right. We're going to get to the demographic dividend because I think that's also quite important. And we've had our former statistician general continue to, talk about South Africa's demographic dividend. But before we do that, you were talking about how if you want to understand, I suppose, a little bit of Africa and where it is right now, you kind of have to go back to the past and look through the history books. And the one thing I love about history is that there'll be certain elements or events that are often overlooked. And if you go back to them, you'd be able to get a clearer picture as to why things are the way they are. And the one history bit that I want to go to is around about 1983, you had this growing concern around poverty in low-income countries. There was a sense of pessimism around Africa's development prospects as well. And that led to the United Nations appointing a commission, which then released a report called the Brundtland Report. Now, talk to me about the impact that report had, in particular to how we look at development in Africa, but also how we look at structural reforms that were brought on by the IMF and the World Bank.
So the Brundtland Report was very, very important. It basically laid the basis for what eventually became the Millennium Development Goals, where we said that we are going to halve extreme poverty by 2000. And that in turn laid the foundation for the Sustainable Development Goals by 2015, I'm sorry. And then the basis for the Sustainable Development Goals, where we have the ambition of eliminating extreme poverty globally by 2030. Now, in the forecast that I make in the book, that I model, I make the forecast that it is almost impossible for Africa to reach that goal by 2030. We are going to, in actual fact, when by 2030 you speak of where poverty still exists in the world, you are largely going to speak about sub-Saharan Africa. Because of our rapidly growing population and low levels of growth, poverty is still going to increase at least for the next 10, 12 years in Africa. So, so we had this, the views of Africa swing between pessimism and optimism. So the Brundtland report came at a time of extreme pessimism on the future of Africa, and also about the quality of African governance. And the IMF and the World Bank looked at Africa, and under the sort of framework of what I think of neoliberal economics said, the problem with Africa is your bad governance. And what we need to do is we need to get the private sector to develop Africa and, in a sense, work around poor governance. Now, of course, now in retrospect, these institutions have changed their views completely, because at low levels of development, the private sector plays a very small role in development. The private sector in poor countries consists of barber shops and informal farming and so on. It doesn't consist of companies that can drive growth. Only when countries get to upper middle income status like South Africa does the private sector become the main engine of growth. So what the World Bank and the IMF were saying was that Africa had to develop in a sense without government. And just look at South Africa and almost every African country, and they will tell you that the first thing we need to do is get a capable, competent, developmentally orientated government in place, governance, because at low levels of development, the quality and the efficiency of government is hugely important. Now, so that era of so-called structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s did huge amount of damage in Africa. And it earned the World Bank and the IMF the enduring enmity of all Africans. Just look at the debate in South Africa. If somebody in South Africa says, guys, we need the IMF and the World Bank because they give the best rates for loans, then you have Kusatu and everybody else up in arms because this is Satan. This is the great evil. It's no longer the case, but they did themselves a lot of harm in those years. So today, when you look at the development of Africa, there is general acceptance that Africa needs a strong, capable state and a governing elite that is orientated towards growth, and that is fundamental, particularly at low levels of development. And then as you go up the GDP per capita curve, the private sector eventually becomes the main engine of growth. And also you require a competitive political system once you have a competitive economic system. And these go together when you become an upper middle, high income country.
Speaking of political system, we do see I suppose call it a wave of democratization in Africa. But the one thing you mentioned is that the levels of democracy seem to outpace improvements in income and education, and they seem to be out of sync. Is that normal, and why is that the case?
The main reason why that's happened is because we've had such a terrible history of bad leadership, military dictatorships, authoritarian leaders, self-serving kleptocrats that have stolen the benefits from the majority of African population. So what you see in Africa, you can talk about it as premature democratization. So when you measure democracy, the levels of democracy in, let's say, low-income African countries versus the level of democracy in low-income countries in the rest of the world, then Africa is in actual fact remarkably democratic. And the same holds for lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries. Every time Africa has higher levels of democracy than you would expect at its level of development, particularly in levels of income and levels of education. Some would then argue that that means democracy in Africa rests on very shallow roots. It has very shallow roots. And to a degree, it's true. But Africans believe in democracy, not because democracy is going to deliver economic growth, because at low levels of development, there's no real relationship between democracy and development. But it comes as you go up the developmental curve. But because they have experienced the alternative. They have experienced poor authoritarian one-party leadership for decades. And therefore, Africans, I always make the analogy, Africa's people look towards the West, the democracy, the individual rights of Western countries mostly. But their leadership looks decidedly towards the East. They love the top-down authoritarian developmental model epitomized by China. Of course, the reality is that Africa will most likely follow the development trajectory of India, which is from the bottom upward. It is chaotic, it is corrupt, it is despite poor governance, and it is largely services-led. It's not led by a strong manufacturing industry. That is one of the analogies that we have to try and change.
Right. The one topic I quite like is the demographic dividend, and I think chapter 3 talks about that, getting to Africa's demographic dividend. So you get to 2017, and the African Union's annual theme for that particular year is titled "Harnessing the Demographic Dividend Through Investment in the Youth." And they had a whole lot of resources that were poured in terms of, reviewing the program, or rather the progress when it comes to their 2006 Africa Youth Charter. And the whole point was that we want to unlock the continent's youth. Now, seeing that we have this growing population and looking at the median age of Africa's, population amongst the youth, one then asks the question then, why are we not able to rapidly grow economies on the back of this youthful population we have?
Because a youthful population on its own guarantees a growing economy, but it doesn't guarantee that incomes grow. If you want average incomes to grow, what needs to expand more rapidly is the working age population versus the dependents. So we typically make a distinction between children below 15 years of age and elderly, 64 and above. These two are your dependent groups of population. In between, you have the working age population, 15 to 64. If this grows relative to your dependents, children and the elderly, it boosts your economic growth. That is the demographic dividend. There are many ways of defining it. Now, Africa only gets to its demographic dividend a positive relationship, which is about 1.7 working age people to dependents, children and the elderly, and about 2050, 2054. That means we only start entering our demographic dividend in 30 years' time. Then we are supposed to start growing rapidly. Because if you look at the history of the Asian tigers, Japan, the USA, the Nordic countries, all of them have benefited from a growing working age population. Why is that? There are three components to growth: labor, capital, and technology. And when you are at low levels of development, labor is your most important contribution to growth. And that's what the one thing that Africa has. We have a large youthful population, but they are so youthful that in actual fact, you can't build schools fast enough. You can't build basic infrastructure fast enough, because there are so many more children that you can't invest in your working age population, because you're busy dealing with this massive growing population pyramid that looks like that. So getting to Africa's demographic dividend, advancing that demographic dividend, the ratio of working age people to dependents, is literally a prerequisite for Africa's development. I say again, Africa only enters its demographic dividend in about 2050 on average. And then we're in that sweet spot for about the next 20 years. That is a major reason why Africa cannot grow rapidly enough. Now, you can change that by advancing female education, generally women's rights generally, by political leadership. So you need people like Museveni in Uganda and the bulldozer in Tanzania. These are condemning their countries to slow growth, because their view is that children is good, children are good, but more children is better, and that is the basis for economic growth. It's not. So we need leadership. And the final thing is, of course, you need to roll out modern contraceptives, because in the short term, there is a huge demand for modern contraceptives in Africa, but the supply is very limited.
Which then brings me to a story you actually touch on in the book. I think it happened about a year ago, and you delivered a presentation at the AU offices in Addis Ababa, and you were talking specifically about that, but some people in the audience didn't take too kindly to that suggestion.
No, because I was speaking about this issue about the demographic dividend, and you had the one elderly male ambassador stand up and said, you just don't understand the value of children and the growing population. But actually I do. But it is, so I really pushed back on that. And the Africa Union thus far in the strategy, the youth strategy that developed was following the standard motherhood and apple pie statement that is, children are our future, they are good. Of course they are. They are all of those things. They are wonderful. But that is not how to get economic growth. And unless you change that relationship of your working, invest more in the children that you have, if I can put it this way, educate them better. And in actual fact, simply by changing the relationship of working age people to dependents, simply doing nothing else, that inevitably makes every African richer and better educated, because every government has more resources to invest in its growing, in the kids that are in school and the students that go to university, because they don't have to build more schools, train more teachers, invest in additional water and sanitation the whole time. So simply changing the demographic, getting to your demographic dividend faster, advancing the demographic dividend. So I model that. So I model and I forecast, one of the few graphs in the book, what would happen with Africa's demographic dividend, the relationship of working age people to dependents out until the end of the century. And then I say, now, what would happen if we advance education in women, we particularly secondary, upper secondary education, there's political leadership, there's women empowerment, and we roll out contraceptives 10% more than it is. And that advances your demographic dividend, and immediately you get to your demographic dividend years earlier, your economy expands, and it's kumbaya. Well, not exactly, but it helps.
Speaking of kumbaya, or a country that could possibly be at a kumbaya moment, is Egypt, which I suppose as you describe it, is on the cusp of that, achieving the age structure that is conducive for economic growth.
Yeah.
But they could squander that. And why is that?
Yeah, Egypt and South Africa, by the way, are more or less at the same. We have a median age of about 25, 26. That means the average age, the half of our population is below 25, 26, and the other half is above. The average for Africa is about 19. So half of Africa's population is below 19, the other half is above 19. So when you get to your demographic dividend, Egypt suffers from a state-led controlled economy, an insider-outsider system. That means that its economy does not provide opportunity for ordinary people, particularly for young people, for educated young people. This is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why we had the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia, where Tunisia has one of the best educated populations in Africa, but they have no opportunity because Ben Ali and the leaders before them have created an insider-outsider system where they control the economy and every aspect of the economy, state-led, top-down system, and ordinary young children that are educated have no opportunity. Their only opportunity is to survive in the informal sector. And they are connected, and then eventually, so Egypt needs significant change in terms of unlocking that potential of allowing particularly small and other businesses to flourish, and changing this insider-outsider system. And that means, in a sense, changing the political system. Because what is happening in Egypt, and we measure the quality of democracy or the lack thereof. There are a number of indices in the world that measure democracy, the levels of democracy, and we can compare the democracy in one country with another. And when you look at the level of democracy, of accountability in Egypt, it is significantly below what you would expect a country to be at Egypt's levels of income and levels of education. So if there's a dysfunction between the aspirations and the expectations of a people and what government delivers, tension builds up, and then something gives, and that became what is known as the Arab Spring. So Egypt has got significant potential that it can unlock, but it needs the appropriate leadership, and it's very difficult because you have a series of pharaohs that have run Egypt for many years, and now LCC is just another pharaoh. So it's easy to talk about these things, but changing that, if that's where you come from, from such a strong tradition of central leadership, very difficult to change that in a country.
I suppose global prospects, when you look at the future of work and the fourth industrial revolution and what comes with it, is all exciting. Yet the one thing you also need to focus on before we even get to the excitement is rejuvenating education. Making sure that we are able to help people be able to achieve the foundation for human development and self-attainment, all the things that education clearly provides. What should policymakers focus on, when it comes to education on the continent? Or is it a case where different countries are different, they all have different needs, but the main focus points for you in terms of policymakers?
So Africa is 55 countries, very, very different countries. And I am, of course, in the book generalizing immensely, but I generally use the World Bank country income classifications for speaking about low-income Africa, lower middle income, and upper middle income Africa. So education is foundational to human development. But what we see in Africa is, let's divide education into the quality of education that you provide and the quantity of education you provide. So let's first talk about quantity. Quantity, the average years of education that an adult has. Let's say adults above 15 years of age or adults above 25 years of age. These are the two standard measures that you work. If you look at the quantity measure, you'll see that Africa has had no catch-up in the last 50, 60, 70 years. The average gap between the amount of education that Africans get, the difference between Africa and the rest of the world, just the average for the rest of the world, is the same as it was 50 years ago. There's no catch-up. So, and one of the reasons for that is because we have such a young population of children coming through that you really need a large education budget and teachers and so on. So quantity is a big problem. If we look at quality, same issue. Actually, Africa is falling behind, further behind in preparing our children and students for the fourth industrial revolution, for thinking and so on, for dealing with the future of work. A future that requires much greater innovation. It requires more of your STEM skills and so on and so forth. So the book, I model where Africa has come from and the future of education in Africa versus other comparisons. The best regions that you can compare Africa to is either South America or South Asia. These are the two other regions in the world that are sort of comparison. And I look at where Africa is going, we fall further and further behind. North Africa does the best. It does the best in all indicators, followed by Southern Africa, and then generally West Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa literally does the worst in every indices that you look at. So I make the argument that modern technology, we have to look at modern technology to find a way of leapfrogging in education. We have to look at ways in which we can rapidly change the way in which we provide education and the quality of education. If we think that we are going to bridge this divide by what is known as the Prussian model of education, which is where I'm a teacher, people sit and I, rote learning. That's not going to work. It will never work rapidly enough. So a big problem in education. But there are ways that you can advance that. If you look at, for example, at South Korea's development trajectory, they, by good private sector leadership, you can, to a degree, compensate for lack of education. Ethiopia is trying to do that. Average years of education in Ethiopia is 2.7 years for an adult. 2.7 years. In other words, the average Ethiopian cannot read or write. Now, that is true for many in Africa. And South Africa, which spends a significant amount of money on education, is simply not getting bang for its buck, or whatever term you want to use. So we need to rethink how we provide education, and the impact that education is going, and how we prepare Africans for the fourth industrial revolution and globalization and all of those things that we also need.
I know we've left the last 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A, so let's check in with Jennifer to see if some questions have come through, if there was anything that you want to focus on. We will have more discussion points. We'll talk about digitization, we'll talk about leapfrogging using technology, we'll talk peace, we'll talk all kinds of things towards the end of the show if people need some ideas in terms of what kind of questions you want to put Jakkie Cilliers on the spot for.
Easy questions.
Right, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Cool, great. We've got a question here from Asanda, who says, hi, thank you very much for a fascinating convo. Would you say you are optimistic about Africa's future, and has this been affected by coronavirus? I think a question on coronavirus was probably inevitable.
Yes. Yes, I am optimistic about Africa. Remember the central storyline. Things are improving in Africa, and we can see that, but not fast and rapid enough to really close the gap between Africa and the rest of the world. So I am optimistic about Africa, and it is quite possible that modern technology will allow Africa to catch up more rapidly than we could ever imagine. Because when you come off a low base, and Nastassia would know this, you can catch up actually easier because you actually leapfrog certain generations of technology. The COVID crisis is huge, and it is going to have a very negative impact on Africa. But I should add that it is still too early to do responsible forecasting on what the impact will be, particularly because Africa has such a youthful population. Remember, median age in Africa is about 19. Median age in Europe is about 45. In the US, it's about 44. So the morbidity relationship, how many people die from COVID in Africa, is just simply unknown at the moment. We may know in a few months' time. What we do know is what the economic impact would be. The IMF last week released economic forecasts on Africa's growth prospects, and it's not a good news story. And if the world goes, well, the world is in a depression. If that depression goes a recession and goes into a depression, it will knock years of Africa's prospects. So our forecasts on poverty, remember I said it's very likely because of its growing population that poverty in Africa will increase for the next, in absolute numbers. The number of poor people will increase, but the ratio comes down slowly, the percentage of Africans that live in extreme poverty. What COVID will do is set Africa further behind. It will set the world back, but it will also accelerate many of the trends that I write about in the book. Accelerate, for example, the change that we see in global value chains. It will probably lead to a more rapid shift and ascendancy of Asia, which is the big growth center of the future, and it will change how manufacturing works in the world. It will change the resource intensity and so on. So I think COVID will have a huge impact. But because I do long-term forecasting, if you look at the 2008-2009 financial crisis in my graphs, it's a blip, because in 2-3 years we haven't recovered because these impacts linger. But at the moment we think this is absolutely an earth-shattering crisis and it is, make no mistake. But one also needs to get perspective from when you're looking long-term out till 2040. So COVID will have an impact, a usually negative impact, but it's not the end of the world.
Right. Interesting. Thank you very much for that. I have a question of my own, if you don't mind. It's interesting for me. This isn't my usual sort of reading matter, but I mean, it is fascinating. And so, but I'm as someone who's interested in writing, in the process of writing, I'm interested in, with a book like this that seems so broad in scope, How do you decide how to structure it and what to focus on? Do you rely on purely on forecasting methodology, or do you go with your gut feel sometimes and what to leave in and what to leave out? What will impact the continent? I'm just interested in, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an actual fact. I struggled with the structure of the book immensely, but I've, over the last 10, 15 years, written a number of papers that I looked at different aspects. So the book is in actual fact just divided into 16 chapters in it, 2 introductory chapters, and then I take different aspects that all belong together, and I just simply work my way through every aspect of society or development. So I start with demographics, look at basic infrastructure, water and sanitation. I look at education. I look at leapfrogging. So I look at peace and security, governance. So at the end of the day, what Africa First does, it provides an integrated, comprehensive assessment of all the challenges and all the opportunities. So it's incredibly ambitious, and there's no doubt that the forecasts will be wrong. If I could predict the future, I'd be a rich man. We can only explore and think about the future in a structured way, but we can't predict the future. So, but thinking about that tells us what the challenges are. Look at the way at the moment which evidence is leading South Africa's fight against the COVID virus. It's actually unprecedented. We have a panel and experts that are saying this is what's going to happen, and that means that we have decent policy. And we all wish that could expand into other areas, but that's a different issue. So Africa First tries to step away from the politics and the political correct debates and tries on the basis of data, without being too data heavy, to explain what these fundamental constraints are. So it was eventually, 10, 15 years of fiddling around with the future of Africa that led me to the structure. But the structure is basically looking at where we are, where we came from, then these 11 scenarios. And then I look at, in certain chapters, I look at the impact of certain scenarios. For example, there's not a scenario on jobs. I look at what is the impact of different other scenarios, let's say provision of education, the demographic dividend on jobs. And there's a chapter on climate change. What is the impact of these different scenarios on carbon emissions? And what is the impact of carbon emissions on Africa's growth prospects? So everything is interrelated, but you can only speak about something that is that complicated if you can just take it apart and deal with it bit by bit. So I'm a generalist. I don't know anything about anything, but I know a lot about little things. A lot of no. You understand?
Use the terms Renaissance man. Since we've been chatting now, we've had a glut of questions come in. So we have 3. So here, I'll just put one up here. Elsa says, hi, Jakkie. In light of your discussion about education, how do you think South Africa should handle the rest of the school year to avoid falling even more behind?
Well, the president's going to talk to us at 8 o'clock tonight in an hour's time and tell us about the next set of plans. What is going to happen with COVID, and we are actually doing some forecasting on the impact of COVID in South Africa and in Africa, is that we are going to remain in some type of lockdown for months. Because what we're trying to do is to keep this curve from not going up too rapidly. So hopefully what will be announced is increasingly a targeted and an intelligent way of responding to COVID. So where every sector that you can unlock from COVID, from the COVID lockdown, you unlock them. So we are hoping that what will happen is eventually, and what I will now say is completely politically incorrect, I know that. But if schools can adhere to distancing and so on, let them restart. Because we really have to try and not let COVID clamp down on our economy. We've already seen riots in certain areas in South Africa. People are desperate. You cannot in a country, well, you cannot in Africa, but even in South Africa, which is a relatively rich country by comparative standards, expect people to stay in a little hut or a little tin shack in Alexandra or whatever for 2 or 3 months. It's physically not possible if they don't have any income. We have to try every bit to get the economy, education, and everything else going. So I'm hoping that what we will see is we will, of course, see more at-home teaching, remote, and all of this kind of stuff. And let's see how far we can push that. Let's see which schools we can open. Let's see what we can do for social distancing. But we've got to get, as quickly as possible, get as much of the economy, education, and so on going. Short answer is that it'll take another week or two of data, I think, before we really know where the trajectory is going and before government is able to make an informed decision.
Okay. Thank you very much. Then we have a question from Eunice, who says, the Chinese influence in Africa is often seen as another form of colonialism, it being faster and more than anticipated in many industries. With this in mind, how will China's involvement in Africa contribute to Africa's development?
Very interesting question. There's a lot about China in the book, because China is Africa's largest trade partner, and China has helped invest in Africa's infrastructure. And many economists and development people that know more about these things than I do will say to you that the biggest deficit that Africa has, is an infrastructure deficit. And the Chinese are the only people that have been prepared to invest in building infrastructure in Africa. Yes, sometimes the infrastructure is below quality, but you get what you pay for. And so on. So China is very important for Africa. But I think Chinese interest in Africa may have peaked. And I write about this in the book. The next big global development thing is India. And I write also a lot about the extent to which Africa is increasingly commodity dependent. We export our commodities. We don't export finished goods. And if we don't change that, we will never grow. But it is true that China's growth up until about 2010 was very commodity intensive. So China imported coal and cocoa and everything from Africa to grow. And going forward, China requires less of that. But it is now today, Africa trades more with China than it does with any other single country. Our trade with the EU and the focus and the European Union investment in Africa is more important and much larger than that of China. But as a single country, China is very important. From a political perspective, many people worry that we are again being caught between the West and China. That is to a degree true. We need both. What we do not need is this kind of war. It's not a war. This kind of trying to manipulate us for the one or the other. We need both Chinese investment, European investment, and American investment. And we need a combination, because Africa will not follow the Chinese developmental trajectory, as I indicated previously. So we need to there's a lot that we can learn from China. The most important lesson that we can learn from China is how it manages foreign investment. The Chinese are masters in it. I just need to plug my computer in. Sorry.
I had the same issue earlier, so.
Okay, I have power.
Okay, cool. Would you like the next question?
Yes.
Okay, it's quite a long one. So it's blocking our faces. Sorry about that. Abednego says, thanks, Jakkie. Great convo with Tash there. My interest is Africa has consumers that don't have a purchasing power. Does this not set it back in terms of entrepreneurship and future growth? Because whatever you launch, it's into a consumerless market. In America, at least 200 million people there are potential consumers for entrepreneurs, fertile soil for development. In South Africa, less than 70% of individual taxes are collected from 10 to 50% of our population. So we are not just poor, we don't have, and then we just go to the Facebook page to see what the rest of the comment is. We're not just poor, we don't have growth prospects. And should we be rather focusing on trying to launch products and services to global markets where there is potential growth, however competitive that may be? I'll take the question off the screen.
Thanks again. A great question. Africa, there are, if you read the reports of Deloitte and all of these consulting companies which try and talk Africa, try and sell their product and sell the size of the African market to customers, they generally They speak about Africa as the next growth area. We are certainly a next growth area, but the consumer market in Africa, the so-called middle class in Africa, is much smaller than most of these consulting companies actually admit, because they define the middle income group. They sort of say, well, your middle income, they normally start nowadays sometimes $2 per person per day, which is just above the extreme poverty line, or they say $10 to $10 to $50 per day per person per day is they just categorize as the sort of consumer middle class, which I think is a gross exaggeration. Africa, so Africa is growing. Our forecast of the average growth rate of all of 55 countries going forward is about 4.7% average out till 2040. Now, that's far too little. Africa needs to grow at least double that if you really want to grow Africa more rapidly. And remember the other point that I made, that the private sector is important, and increasingly the private sector can make profit at lower levels of development. There are innovative ways of using modern technology to bring people into the formal sector. For example, the way that M-Pesa in Kenya is able to use money transactions, banking, and so that means that you can more people can have access to finances. You can bring them into the formal sector of the economy. The government can tax them at a very small rate. That all helps government capacity. So the speed at which you are able today to transition from an informal based economy into a formal based economy, that you are part of a formal economy, actually spurs growth quite dramatically. And that's one of the factors, the unintended consequences of digitization and the fourth industrial revolution. And one of the chapters in the book, I write about Ghana, another country that I visited quite often. And I indicate how Ghana is leapfrogging by using all kinds of digitization and block technologies to, for example, give every person, in simple terms, a postal address, to give every person an ID, to register people that they can participate in banking and so on. Now, 50 years ago,
I saw today that Ghana are using drones to deliver COVID swabs to hospitals.
Correct. So that's a way in which modern technology allows you to leapfrog very rapidly. So whereas in the past, if you wanted to develop a postal system, you needed to have streets and addresses and stuff. Now you need a grid reference on a geomap. So and you can then deliver your post through a drone. So every person of us can get, can order my book on Amazon and have it delivered through a drone to his house. But you get the point. So that is ways in which technology is allowing Africa, coming from a very low base, to leapfrog very rapidly. So one of the scenarios in the book is a whole scenario and a chapter on leapfrogging. It tries to emulate the impact that has on different levels of development. And it is going to be amazing at every aspect of our development. How exactly we can leapfrog in education, and how we can leapfrog in basic infrastructure. Water sanitation, of course, is a difficult question. But yeah, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. And those are all the questions we have at the moment. So Nastassia, if you would like to make some...
Jakkie, what do you want people to get out of this book? I mean, there are very few graphs, as you say, wink, wink. But what do you want people to get as, the main answer to a whole host of questions they may have?
It is an understanding of what drives development. And some of it is basic stuff. But we tend to forget that because we get carried away in political speak and quick solutions. Many of the visions about the future of Africa are what I would refer to as blue skies visions. So it's not what Africa can achieve, but it's sort of what we would like. And we set up, yes, if we can do by 2030, by 2020, we can silence the guns, which was a slogan of Agenda 2063, which is the latest big plan that the African Union developed for Africa. Well, it is 2020. The guns still seem to be fairly active. It's a crazy objective because instability and development, in a sense, go hand in hand. When countries develop, they actually are often quite unstable. So it's not that you can silence the guns and then you have peace and then you develop. In actual fact, instability is part of development. And these kind of relationships, understanding why Africa is perhaps moving at the pace that it is, these are important insights. So understanding where Africa comes from, the challenges that lie ahead, and the long road that lies ahead. There are no magic solutions, but it is a bright and a positive future. And that future, I think, holds incredible promise. The reality is that returns on investment in Africa is higher than it is anywhere else in the world. But the people that invest in Africa are generally from the East. The West generally look at Africa as a problem. Of course, they helped create the problem. That is true. But the opportunities, that's why earlier we talked a little bit about China, the differences. And the difference is that the Chinese and the Indians and Asians generally see Africa more as an opportunity than as a burden. And this is part of the legacy problems that we have to counter the whole time.
All right, that's it from me. Thank you so much, Jakkie and Jennifer, for hosting us. It's really been a really informative conversation, and I hope many of you will go out and get the book as an ebook, right, Jennifer?
Yes, so that's we actually have one more question, which says, how much is the book and is it currently available in print and electronic edition? So all the bookshops in South Africa are shut at the moment during lockdown, so you can't get a physical copy yet. You can wait until after lockdown for that and then go and support your local bookshop, who will be needing your support very much after lockdown. But while you wait for that, Jonathan Bull Publishers are having a special on the book at the moment. So I think it's about 100 Rand. The final price depends on the exchange rate, I think, but it's available on all ebook platforms. So that's Amazon, Kobo, Etsy, Snaplify, wherever you get your ebooks, it'll be there. And
that's
it's
$5 on Amazon, I think. So it's cheap. Buy two.
Yeah, get one and send it to your cousin as well, and that uncle that needs to know what's happening in Africa. Cool. Thank you very, very much for joining us. There was a fascinating conversation, and go and buy the book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Nastassia.
Good night.
Good night.